Fellow Toastmasters, friends, you should write your family history. Why? My mother told me not to write my family history because she thought I would only talk about the gloomy things. No, don't talk about the gloomy things, talk about the fun things. Even if you look at Shakespeare's tragedies, what he does is he interleaves all the bad bits with funny bits. You have minor characters coming along and saying funny things. Now I'm going to tell you about several funny things that happened to funny people in my funny family. I'm probably going to tell you about my beloved mother, and my beloved father, and my beloved uncle, and my beloved son. And if we have time, we'll go on to my friends and their funny families, because they're all very funny. We'll start with my funny mother. When my mother died, I was most upset, and for days I could only talk about the sad things that had happened, and how lonely I was without her, and how dreadful it was. And then one day I discovered that I had written down, while I was out in Singapore, everything that happened in our lives. And I couldn't believe it. I had all the funny things my mother had said to me on the phone. I even had the time when I went to give a speech. And I talked about dogs. And I lifted up my scarf and talked about dogs, and my mother was at the front row, like Angela here and Peter here, laughing away and looking absolutely entranced. And I talked about birds, and my mother looked absolutely entranced. And I talked about butterflies, and my mother looked absolutely entranced. And afterwards I said to her, Mother, what did you think of my speech? She said it was wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And I said, oh, you said that just because you're my mother. And she said, yes, of course I did. And I said, was there anything which would have made the speech better for you? She said, yes, if I had remembered to put in my hearing aid. So when I read that back in my family history, I stopped feeling miserable about the fact that I no longer had my mother, and I remembered the funny things, the funny times I'd had with my mother, and it cheered me up no end. Similarly with my father, after he died, for the first few weeks afterwards I could do nothing but cry and feel miserable and tell people about And then I started looking back at family history and seeing all the funny things. And I discovered something when I gave a speech to people like you about my mother and my father. The fact that I didn't discover that my father was deaf until after my mother died. And I asked my father if he wanted a cup of tea, and he looked at me and I said, do you want a cup of tea? He said, yes, please, dear. And I realised that all my adult life, my mother had done all the talking. And my father had done all the listening. Except that he was deaf in one ear, and if he stood on that side, he couldn't hear a thing. And all he did, all his life, was nod. Now you may have one or two relatives like that, who you think are great listeners, and all they do is nod. And when you lose your hearing, the secret is you don't talk, you just nod. And everyone will think you're a great listener. So that is the moral of my father's life. Now we come on to my beloved uncle, Jill's favourite. My beloved uncle was also deaf, and he was a musician. And he hid his hearing aids under his ears so that nobody knew he was deaf. And because he memorised all the tunes, he could play perfectly. And nobody knew. But the funniest thing that happened was after he died. We couldn't bury him. He wanted to be buried in his late wife's grave, but we didn't know where his late wife's grave was. He said it was in Hendon. Do you know how many cemeteries there are in Hendon? When you get to Hendon, they ask you what number is the plot. And the cemetery goes from there to there as far as the eye can see, and you walk along and you walk along. I didn't even know what name she had. And when I turned up to register burial, and I told this story, the registrar said, "Hoo, hoo, hoo, your uncle has lost the plot." He thought this was hilariously funny. I thought this was hilariously funny. My son thought this was hilariously funny. Everyone thought this was hilariously funny. And even now, when I feel miserable about my uncle, I cheer myself up thinking, oh, we lost the plot. Now, in my family history, I have little funny things that we have accidentally said. For example, driving down Rayners Lane, we go opposite, looking for a parking place opposite the station, and we drive down the road, and I say, I hope it gets narrower and narrower, and I say, I hope we're going to be able to get out of this road. And my son said, yes, so do I. It's a one-way street. Then my friends had a father who was a doctor, and he went to Israel, to Jerusalem, and he was asked if he would sit next to somebody, because the pilot wouldn't take off unless somebody sat next to this person. And this person had the Jerusalem syndrome, which means you go to Jerusalem and you're so excited by the fact that Jesus was there, you think you must be Jesus or an angel. And this man thought he was Jesus. And this rather unnerved the pilot. It also unnerved all the people on the plane, because this passenger got up and he went and offered his bread to everybody. Would you like a piece of bread? Would you like a piece of bread? Would you like a piece of bread? Would you like some water? Holy water? And nobody said yes. They all sort of looked like that. And my friend was told by the air hostess that he had to stay sitting next to this person all the way through, and someone would be meeting him at the other end. When they got to the other end, there were two men in white coats. The man next to him said, "Ah, look, my angels have come to meet me." So there you are. Write your family history. Your family history, your friend's family history. It will entertain you